In the bitter November of 1950, the Korean peninsula was transforming into a frozen wasteland of unimaginable hostility. The Taebaek Mountains loomed like jagged teeth against a mercilessly gray sky, as temperatures plummeted toward minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The United Nations forces, primarily the hardened veterans of the United States 1st Marine Division, pushed relentlessly northward. Their ultimate objective was the Yalu River, the natural border separating North Korea from Manchuria. They marched forward, believing the war was already won, entirely unaware that the frozen mountains ahead were breathing. Supreme Commander General Douglas MacArthur had confidently assured Washington that the boys would be home by Christmas, dismissing any imminent threat. This reckless optimism cascaded down the chain of command, creating a dangerous illusion of absolute security among the advancing echelons. However, Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, harbored deep reservations about this perilous northern thrust. He observed the overextended supply lines and the treacherous terrain with the sharp, calculating eye of a seasoned tactician. He quietly ordered his unit commanders, "Keep your lines tight. I do not like the feel of this empty valley." Smith's strategic caution was fundamentally at odds with the aggressive momentum demanded by his superiors at the 10th Corps headquarters. He deliberately slowed the advance of his Marines, establishing fortified supply dumps along the narrow, winding dirt road leading to the Chosin Reservoir. This singular supply route was a fragile lifeline, bordered by deep gorges on one side and sheer cliffs on the other. Every mile gained felt increasingly isolated from the main Allied forces. The silence of the surrounding ridges was unnatural, devoid of the scattered resistance expected during this campaign. Deep within the shadows of those silent ridges, a massive and deadly adversary was meticulously orchestrating a monumental deception. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, under the iron-willed command of General Song Shilun, had crossed the Yalu River in absolute secrecy. Song's 9th Army Group comprised roughly 120,000 battle-hardened soldiers, moving like a dark, silent tide through the unforgiving winter landscape. They were masters of camouflage and night movement, strictly forbidden from traveling during daylight hours. Anyone spotted moving under the sun was to be immediately shot by their own officers to maintain absolute operational security. This draconian discipline yielded terrifyingly effective results, completely blinding the sophisticated aerial reconnaissance of the United States military. American surveillance planes soared over the snow-covered valleys, reporting back empty landscapes and completely undisturbed terrain. In reality, entire Chinese divisions were huddled motionless beneath white capes, shivering in the sub-zero temperatures but holding their positions with fanatical resolve. They endured frostbite and starvation, silently watching the American columns snake their way up the mountain roads. 100,000 phantoms watched from the snow-capped ridges, waiting for the Americans to walk perfectly into the center of the kill zone. The geography of the Chosin Reservoir provided the ultimate setting for this meticulously planned strategic annihilation. It was not a true lake, but an artificial body of water created by a dam, surrounded by incredibly steep, densely forested mountains. As the 1st Marine Division approached the village of Udamni on the western edge of the reservoir, their formations inevitably stretched thin. The bitter cold began to degrade their equipment. Vehicle batteries died. Weapons required constant attention, and the very ground became too hard to dig proper defensive trenches. Nature itself was actively conspiring with the unseen enemy forces. Despite the mounting environmental challenges, the American political and military leadership remained blindly committed to their fatal miscalculation. Intelligence reports from the front lines, detailing captures of Chinese prisoners who openly admitted to massive troop concentrations, were systematically dismissed or heavily sanitized. The prevailing arrogance dictated that a peasant army lacking mechanized transport and heavy artillery could never pose a significant threat to a modern, fully equipped Western military machine. This hubris effectively placed a blindfold on the operational commanders, compelling them to blindly march their men directly into a vast, meticulously constructed snare of human flesh and steel. General Smith, trusting his instincts over the flawed intelligence reports, continued to implement his defensive measures with quiet urgency. He insisted on building a temporary airstrip at Hagaru-ri, a small village situated at the southern tip of the frozen reservoir. When questioned by staff officers about the necessity of this laborious engineering project, Smith replied firmly, "If we are cut off, this strip will be our only way to evacuate the wounded and bring in ammunition." His foresight was a profound act of leadership, laying the critical foundation for the desperate survival struggle rapidly approaching them. By late November, the chilling reality of the situation began to manifest in small, unsettling skirmishes along the vulnerable flanks. Marine patrols pushing further into the mountains frequently encountered brief, violent engagements with unidentified enemy units before the attackers melted back into the wilderness. These were not the disorganized remnants of the North Korean army. These were disciplined, heavily armed infantrymen probing the American defenses for fatal weaknesses. The tension among the enlisted men skyrocketed as rumors of a massive impending assault spread through the freezing encampments, whispering through the ranks like deadly wind. The Chinese strategy was rooted in classical military doctrines of encirclement and annihilation, perfectly adapted to the brutal Korean winter. General Song Shilun planned to allow the Marines to stretch their forces along the reservoir's roads before simultaneously attacking from all sides. He intended to chop the American columns into isolated fragments, destroying them piece by piece under the overwhelming weight of numerical superiority. The freezing temperatures were factored into the Chinese operational calculus, viewed as a natural ally that would paralyze American mobility and drastically reduce the effectiveness of mechanized support units. As Thanksgiving approached, a surreal sense of normalcy was artificially imposed upon the frontline troops by the distant high command. Hot turkey dinners were incredibly flown in and distributed to the shivering Marines in a bizarre juxtaposition of holiday tradition and impending slaughter. Men ate their festive meals from frozen tin mess kits, stomping their feet in the deep snow to stave off the biting, agonizing frostbite. The illusion of a swift victory and a comfortable winter was actively maintained, even as the invisible noose tightened inextricably around their isolated, freezing positions. Captain William Barber, commanding Fox Company, positioned his men strategically on an isolated hill overlooking the crucial Toktong Pass. This narrow geographic choke point controlled the only road connecting the Marine units at Udamni with the vital supply base at Hagaru-ri. Barber surveyed the stark landscape, fully grasping the tactical importance of his exposed defensive perimeter. He walked among his shivering troops, offering a stark assessment, masked as encouragement. "Dig deep, boys, because if they come, they will come down this road, and we are the only thing standing between them and the division." The sun finally dipped below the jagged mountain peaks on the evening of November 27th, plunging the Chosin Reservoir into an abyssal darkness. The temperature continued its deadly descent, freezing canteens solid and turning the lubricating oil inside automatic weapons into a useless, thick paste. The Marines settled into their shallow, frozen fighting holes, staring out into the pitch-black void of the surrounding, silent forest. An eerie, unnatural stillness settled over the entire region, completely masking the movement of tens of thousands of Chinese infantrymen creeping toward their assault positions. At the highest levels of the Chinese command, the final orders for the massive, coordinated offensive were issued with cold precision. Signal flares were distributed, and buglers prepared their instruments to coordinate the complex battlefield maneuvers in the total absence of modern radio equipment. General Song Shilun observed the map of the reservoir, confident that the American forces were hopelessly trapped within his meticulously crafted strategic encirclement. He anticipated a swift, decisive victory that would completely obliterate the 1st Marine Division and violently alter the entire trajectory of the escalating conflict. Back in Tokyo, General MacArthur remained blissfully ignorant of the impending catastrophe, continuing to draft plans for post-war occupation policies. The disconnect between the comfortable strategic headquarters and the freezing, desperate tactical reality on the ground was a staggering failure of military intelligence. The Marines at Chosin were entirely alone, physically isolated by brutal geography and strategically abandoned by a leadership blinded by its own arrogant assumptions. They were standing precisely at the epicenter of a massive geopolitical fault line, completely unaware that the ground beneath their boots would fracture. The profound isolation of the Chosin Reservoir magnified the psychological terror of the impending engagement for every soldier on the line. There was no rear area to fall back upon, no safe haven beyond the immediate perimeter of their hastily constructed defensive positions. The winding dirt road behind them, their singular lifeline to the sea, was already quietly being severed by invisible enemy detachments slipping through the dark mountains. The trap was not merely geographical, it was deeply psychological, designed to instill absolute hopelessness before the first shot was ever fired. In the quiet hours just before midnight, the tension along the marine lines reached a nearly unbearable, palpable crescendo of silent dread. Seasoned combat veterans strained their eyes against the absolute darkness, watching for shadows moving against the slightly brighter background of the snow. They listened intently, but the freezing wind howling through the mountain passes obscured any subtle sounds of the massive enemy approach. The unseen Chinese army had closed the final distance, bringing overwhelming numbers directly to the edge of the American defensive perimeter without triggering a single warning alarm. General Smith's earlier insistence on maintaining unit cohesion and establishing secure supply points was about to be put to the ultimate, bloody test. His cautious deployment, though heavily criticized by his superiors just days earlier, was the only factor preventing immediate, total annihilation of his forces. The stage was now fully set for one of the most brutal, desperate, and heavily mythologized military engagements in the entire recorded history of human warfare. The invisible noose had been perfectly tied, completely tightened, and was waiting for the trapdoor to swing violently open. The men huddled in their trenches, clutching their frozen rifles, unaware that the coming hours would demand unimaginable sacrifices from every single individual. They were not merely fighting a political war. They were about to be plunged into a primal, horrific struggle for fundamental physical survival. The temperature gauge read 30 degrees below zero, but the true chill was the unseen presence of an overwhelming enemy force waiting in the blackness. The historical narrative of the Chosin Reservoir was about to be violently written in frozen blood on the unforgiving mountain slopes. As the final seconds of the evening ticked away, the deceptive silence of the frozen wasteland was suddenly and permanently shattered. The meticulously planned Chinese ambush, executed with devastating precision and overwhelming numbers, finally revealed its terrifying scale to the isolated American defenders. The catastrophic failure of intelligence, the lethal arrogance of high command, and the brutal, unforgiving nature of the winter terrain instantly collided. The invisible noose was invisible no more, and the trapped men were abruptly thrust into a nightmarish battle against complete annihilation in the darkest depths of hell. The absolute silence of the -30-degree night was not broken by artillery, but by the terrifying shrill shriek of wooden flutes echoing from every direction. It began precisely at 10 o'clock on the evening of November 27th. Green flares suddenly hissed into the pitch-black sky, casting a sickly, supernatural glow across the snow-covered ridges. Following the flares, the haunting blasts of bugles and the frantic clatter of cymbals erupted simultaneously from the surrounding darkness. This was not a conventional Western assault. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological weapon designed to shatter the nerves of the defenders. The Marines stationed around the perimeter of Udamni jolted awake in their frozen foxholes, violently thrust from exhaustion into sheer terror. A tidal wave of Chinese infantry materialized out of the darkness, charging down the steep slopes, clad in white quilted uniforms that had rendered them practically invisible against the snow. They did not attack in highly structured mechanized formations, but in a relentless, flowing mass of humanity that seemed completely impervious to initial casualties. The sheer volume of the assault immediately threatened to overwhelm the thinly stretched American defensive lines bordering the frozen reservoir. Confusion instantly gripped the command posts as multiple units simultaneously reported massive enemy incursions along their respective fronts. The rudimentary field telephone lines were quickly severed by mortar fire, leaving individual company commanders completely isolated and forced to make instantaneous, life-or-death tactical decisions. By midnight, the objective was no longer the Yalu River. The singular objective for 30,000 Marines was living to see the dawn. General Smith, receiving fragmented and chaotic reports at his Hagaru-ri headquarters, realized with terrifying clarity that his entire division had been perfectly boxed inside a massive, synchronized death trap. At the critical Toktong Pass, Captain William Barber and his roughly 240 men of Fox Company faced the full, unrestrained fury of the Chinese assault. The strategic importance of their isolated hill position meant that the enemy command had dedicated vastly disproportionate resources to completely eradicate them. Barber shouted orders over the deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. "Hold the line at all costs. If they take this hill, the entire division is cut into pieces." The night sky was illuminated by the constant, deadly crisscross of green and red tracer rounds. The brutal reality of the sub-zero temperatures immediately compounded the sheer lethality of the raging combat. American Browning automatic rifles and water-cooled machine guns jammed repeatedly as the heavy lubricating oil froze solid within the complex internal mechanisms. Desperate Marines were forced to urinate directly onto their frozen weapons just to thaw the actions long enough to fire a few crucial bursts into the advancing waves. Men fought viciously in close quarters, using entrenching tools, bayonets, and bare fists, when their primary firearms completely failed them in the most critical moments of the chaotic engagement. The Chinese soldiers, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, suffered from their own horrific logistical and environmental nightmares. Lacking adequate winter footwear, thousands charged into the blinding American defensive fire on feet completely blackened and destroyed by severe frostbite. They were armed primarily with submachine guns and stick grenades, requiring them to close within point-blank range to inflict significant damage upon the entrenched American positions. As the first waves were mowed down by Marine machine guns, subsequent ranks simply stepped over the rising piles of frozen corpses to press the relentless, fanatical attack forward. Private First Class Hector Cafferata of Fox Company found himself thrust into an unimaginably desperate situation when his fire team's position was completely overrun. Clad only in his light combat jacket and boots without warm socks, Cafferata stood fully exposed in the freezing trench line, desperately hurling back live Chinese grenades before they could detonate among his wounded comrades. When his rifle was empty, he grabbed an entrenching tool and fought like a possessed man, personally stopping a major enemy flanking maneuver through sheer, unadulterated willpower and a complete disregard for his own physical survival. The medical situation across the fractured American lines deteriorated with terrifying rapidity as the casualty count surged exponentially during the initial hours. Navy corpsmen crawling through the snow discovered that their syrettes of morphine were frozen, completely solid, rendering them totally useless for the screaming, desperately wounded men. The precious blood plasma, essential for treating severe traumatic shock, had turned to useless ice inside its glass bottles. Corpsmen resorted to holding the frozen medical supplies inside their mouths, using their own core body heat to slowly thaw the life-saving liquids while bullets snapped brutally overhead. Throughout the endless night, the terrifying sound of the Chinese bugles continued to signal fresh, relentless waves of infantry assaults against the exhausted defenders. General Song Shilun ruthlessly exploited his numerical advantage, continuously feeding new, unexhausted divisions into the meat grinder of the Chosin Reservoir perimeter. He firmly believed that the overwhelming shock of the initial night attack would induce widespread panic and cause the complete collapse of the American defensive structure. However, he drastically underestimated the hardened discipline and sheer, stubborn tenacity of the veteran Marines facing his massive, synchronized offensive maneuvers. As the dark hours dragged on, the fragmented American units began to adapt to the chaotic reality of their desperate, isolated situations. Artillery batteries at Hagaruri lowered their massive howitzer tubes to fire completely flat, unleashing devastating, point-blank barrages of high-explosive shells directly into the charging Chinese infantry columns. The devastating firepower of the American artillery temporarily halted several major penetrations, buying precious time for the disorganized infantry units to desperately plug the bleeding gaps in their crumbling perimeter lines. Yet, the sheer volume of attackers meant that every stabilized sector was immediately threatened anew. Up on the vital ridge at Toktong Pass, Captain Barber suffered a severe gunshot wound to the leg but absolutely refused to be evacuated or relinquish command. He dragged himself along the bloody, frozen perimeter, continuously repositioning his heavy machine guns to cover the most vulnerable approaches to the vital hill. "Nobody leaves this position," Barber coldly informed his beleaguered platoon leaders. "We hold the high ground, and we keep the road open, or everyone down in that valley dies." His unwavering resolve became the crucial anchor holding Fox Company together under unimaginable pressure. The sheer scale of the battlefield chaos made coordinated counterattacks practically impossible during the darkest hours of the massive engagement. Units were completely mixed, officers were rapidly killed or incapacitated, and survival relied entirely upon the localized, brutal actions of individual squads and fire teams. The intense, close-quarters combat was lit only by the stroboscopic flashes of exploding grenades and the terrifyingly bright magnesium flares slowly drifting down from the sky. It was a chaotic, primordial struggle where modern military tactics dissolved into a savage, instinctual brawl for immediate, bloody survival in the snow. The Chinese commanders constantly shifted their points of attack, probing the Marine lines for any sign of weakness or impending structural collapse. When they identified a gap, they poured hundreds of soldiers into the breach, blowing their shrill whistles to coordinate the violent, localized breakthrough attempts. The psychological toll on the defending Marines was immense, as the sheer darkness masked the true size of the enemy forces constantly hurling themselves against the barbed wire. The relentless pressure was deliberately designed to break the human spirit long before it physically broke the established defensive lines. As the first faint traces of dawn finally began to lighten the eastern horizon, the terrifying magnitude of the nighttime slaughter became horribly visible. The slopes surrounding the American positions were completely carpeted with thousands of frozen Chinese corpses, piled in grotesque, unnatural mounds of shredded, quilted fabric. The surviving Marines, physically exhausted and critically low on essential ammunition, stared out at the frozen carnage with hollow, utterly traumatized eyes. They had barely survived the initial onslaught, but they knew with grim certainty that the coming daylight would offer only a temporary, fleeting reprieve. General Smith hastily convened a meeting with his surviving regimental commanders via the newly established and highly fragile radio network. The operational picture was incredibly bleak. The division was effectively sliced into three distinct, heavily besieged pockets at Udumni, Hagaruri, and Kodori. The vital road connecting these isolated garrisons was completely infested with thousands of Chinese troops, severing any hope of immediate resupply or conventional reinforcement. The original mission of advancing to the Yalu River was now officially recognized as a complete, catastrophic impossibility in the face of such overwhelming, deeply entrenched enemy resistance. Despite the crippling casualties and the hopeless strategic situation, a strange, grim determination began to solidify among the surviving American forces. The initial shock of the massive ambush had fully dissipated, replaced by a cold, calculating anger and an absolute refusal to be completely annihilated in the mountains. Captain Barber, still commanding Fox Company from a bloody stretcher, watched the sun slowly rise over the frozen bodies scattered across his blood-soaked perimeter. He knew the enemy would inevitably return when darkness fell again, and he began aggressively preparing his remaining men for another slaughter. The Chinese troops, heavily exhausted by their relentless nighttime assaults, systematically withdrew into the surrounding forested hills to escape the devastating threat of American close air support. Daylight brought the terrifying roar of Marine Corsair fighter planes swooping down from the sky, unleashing rockets and incredibly destructive napalm canisters upon any exposed enemy formations. The tactical advantage temporarily shifted back to the Americans, allowing them precious hours to desperately redistribute their dwindling ammunition stocks and tend to their massive numbers of critically wounded personnel. The frozen battlefield briefly paused its relentless, bloody consumption. General Song Shilun surveyed the horrific aftermath from his concealed mountain headquarters, realizing his massive gamble had failed to instantly crush the 1st Marine Division. He had severely underestimated the incredible volume of defensive firepower the Americans could generate, resulting in staggering, practically unsustainable losses within his leading assault divisions. However, the Chinese commander remained coldly confident in his ultimate strategic victory, knowing the Americans were completely trapped without any viable avenue of escape. He simply ordered his subordinate commanders to regroup their battered units and prepare to resume the strangulation as soon as night returned. The absolute freezing temperatures continued to claim casualties on both sides even during the brief lulls in the heavy infantry combat. Frostbite silently ravaged hands and feet, transforming capable frontline soldiers into helpless, agonizing casualties without a single shot being fired. Medical personnel frantically amputated blackened, completely necrotic toes and fingers in primitive, unheated field tents, using surgical instruments that were terrifyingly cold to the touch. The brutal Korean winter was a completely impartial killer, indiscriminately punishing both the trapped American defenders and the massively overextended Chinese attackers with equal, devastating cruelty throughout the day. As the late afternoon shadows once again began to lengthen across the blood-stained snow, the chilling realization of the impending night settled heavily over the Marines. They knew the terrifying bugles would soon shatter the freezing silence, bringing another massive, unstoppable wave of fanatical infantry directly into their shattered lines. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir had decisively mutated from a chaotic ambush into a horrifying, protracted siege of monumental proportions. The trap was firmly shut, the casualties were catastrophic, and the true, agonizing test of absolute human endurance was only just beginning. The brutal dawn over the Chosin Reservoir illuminated a landscape transformed into a frozen graveyard of shattered ambitions. The 1st Marine Division found itself completely fragmented, isolated into 3 distinct perimeters that were rapidly suffocating under the relentless pressure of General Song Shilun's 9th Army Group. The initial shock of the massive ambush had faded, replaced by the terrifying realization that survival required an immediate, unified breakout. The commanding officers recognized that staying in their current defensive postures would inevitably lead to systematic annihilation by the overwhelming Chinese forces. The plummeting temperatures became a relentless, impartial executioner that ruthlessly claimed victims from both sides of the desperately frozen conflict. Men found their boots frozen solid to their deeply blackened, frostbitten feet, while the simple act of breathing in the sub-zero air scorched their lungs like inhaling shards of broken glass. When the blood froze before it even touched the Korean dirt, the Marines realized the weather was as lethal as the enemy's bullets. Survival depended entirely on constant movement, defying the paralyzing grip of the merciless winter environment. The immediate tactical imperative was to consolidate the hopelessly fractured American forces before the Chinese could destroy them piecemeal. The heavily besieged garrison at Udimni, located at the furthest northern edge of the reservoir, had to miraculously fight its way southward through miles of enemy-infested mountain passes. Their destination was the marginally more secure divisional command post at Hagaruri, which was itself fighting off massive, suicidal infantry charges every single night. The winding, ice-covered road connecting these 2 desperately isolated outposts was completely blocked by thousands of entrenched Chinese soldiers. Men like Private First Class Hector Caffarata continued to demonstrate an incomprehensible level of physical endurance and raw combat ferocity. Despite suffering severe frostbite and a heavily bleeding combat wound, Caffarata stubbornly refused medical evacuation and dragged himself back onto the frontline firing positions. His extraordinary individual actions mirrored the collective resolve solidifying across the entire frozen American perimeter as the men embraced the grim reality of their situation. They understood completely that nobody was coming to their immediate rescue. They alone had to forcefully carve their own bloody path to salvation. Inside the heavily fortified command bunker at Hagaruri, Major General Oliver P. Smith stared intently at his constantly updated tactical maps. The sprawling red arrows representing the massive Chinese encirclement practically swallowed the tiny, isolated blue circles denoting his surviving Marine battalions. Back in Tokyo and Washington, panic was rapidly spreading through the highest levels of military leadership as they anticipated the worst defeat in American history. Smith, however, maintained an unnerving, icy composure, refusing to let the terrifying strategic reality shatter his profound faith in his battle-hardened troops. When a visibly shaken war correspondent desperately asked the general if the mighty 1st Marine Division was officially retreating, The response became legendary. Smith despised the very concept of a retreat, understanding the devastating psychological impact such a word would have on his exhausted men. Surrounded by 10 divisions, General Smith uttered the words that redefined military history. Retreat, hell. We're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction. This singular statement instantly transformed a terrifying, chaotic withdrawal into a highly aggressive, focused, tactical maneuver in the minds of the defenders. This profound psychological shift was immediately communicated down the chain of command, fundamentally altering the entire dynamic of the desperate battle. The Marines were no longer fighting simply to survive the night. They were organizing a massive, heavily armed fighting column designed to violently smash through the Chinese lines. Engineers furiously worked to repair damaged vehicles, while quartermasters systematically destroyed any excess supplies and sensitive equipment that could not be carried. The order was given to strictly preserve ammunition and prepare for a relentless, moving offensive down the frozen mountain road. High in his concealed mountain headquarters, Chinese General Song Shilun observed the frantic American preparations with a mixture of disbelief and growing frustration. He had confidently expected the isolated Marine units to eventually surrender or simply faint to death after sustaining such catastrophic, irreplaceable combat losses. Realizing that his prey was preparing to forcefully shatter his meticulously constructed trap, Song ordered his remaining divisions to heavily fortify the key mountain passes. He was determined to bleed the advancing American column dry, turning the narrow dirt road into an inescapable corridor of absolute slaughter. The incredibly fragile, hastily constructed airstrip at Hagaru-ri suddenly became the single most important piece of real estate in North Korea. Despite the constant threat of incoming mortar fire, daring cargo pilots continuously landed their heavily laden aircraft on the deeply frozen, desperately short runway. They unloaded tons of desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies before quickly loading their cabins with the most critically wounded, bleeding soldiers. Over 4,000 casualties were miraculously evacuated by air, significantly increasing the mobility and combat effectiveness of the surviving infantry preparing for the massive breakout. On the morning of December 1st, the brutally battered regiments trapped at Udamni finally began their desperately coordinated fighting breakout. They slowly pushed southward along the ice-covered road, closely supported by roaring Marine Corsair aircraft that aggressively pounded the surrounding ridges with napalm and rockets. Every single curve in the mountain road was heavily defended by entrenched Chinese machine guns, forcing the freezing Marines to violently clear the high ground inch by bloody inch. The massive column of vehicles, wounded, and fighting men moved at an agonizingly slow, deadly pace through the frozen hell. Their primary objective was to reach the heavily besieged, utterly exhausted men of Fox Company, who were still miraculously holding the vital Toktong Pass. Captain William Barber's incredibly stubborn defense had successfully kept the crucial mountain road open, despite his unit suffering an absolutely catastrophic casualty rate. When the leading elements of the Udamni breakout force finally linked up with the shattered remnants of Fox Company, hardened combat veterans openly wept. The vital link was temporarily secured, allowing the massive, bleeding column to slowly continue its incredibly hazardous journey toward Hagaru-ri. By the 4th of December, the exhausted, freezing survivors from Udamni finally stumbled into the heavily fortified American perimeter at Hagaru-ri. General Smith had successfully consolidated his fractured forces, but the most difficult, terrifying phase of their desperate escape was still looming ahead. They now had to punch through the deepest, most heavily defended sections of the Chinese encirclement to reach the coastal port of Hungnam. Ahead of them lay the treacherous Funchalen Pass, where a destroyed bridge over a massive gorge threatened to permanently seal their frozen, bloody doom. By the 6th of December, the consolidated 1st Marine Division began its agonizingly slow, fighting withdrawal out of Hagaru-ri toward the port of Hungnam. The horrific reality of their desperate situation was vividly reflected in the composition of their battered motorized column. The dead rode silently strapped to the trucks, while the living fought for every bloody inch of ice-covered road. Over 1,000 critically wounded men were packed into the freezing vehicles, leaving the able-bodied infantry to trudge through the heavy snow, constantly battling the relentless wind and the ever-present Chinese snipers hiding in the jagged cliffs above. The brutal march south was a continuous, rolling firefight that demanded unimaginable physical and psychological endurance from every single exhausted soldier. General Song Shilun, desperate to completely destroy the escaping American forces, ordered his remaining divisions to violently assault the flanks of the moving column. The Chinese troops, despite suffering from catastrophic casualties and severe starvation, launched relentless human wave attacks during the darkest hours of the freezing nights. The Marines fiercely repelled these suicidal charges, utilizing their devastating close air support during the brief daylight hours to systematically torch the surrounding mountain ridges with massive amounts of burning napalm. The battered division reached Cotonou on the 7th of December, but temporary relief was immediately shattered by terrifying intelligence reports. Just 3 miles south lay the treacherous Funchalen Pass, a notoriously steep, winding mountain road representing their only possible escape route. The Chinese command had brilliantly recognized this geographical choke point and completely destroyed the vital bridge, spanning a massive, impassable gorge. A sheer drop of 1,000 feet stood between them and salvation, forcing an engineering miracle from the sky or assuring their complete annihilation. General Oliver P. Smith summoned his senior engineering officers to evaluate the catastrophic situation at the destroyed Gatehouse Bridge. The physical gap was only about 30 feet wide, but the sheer, vertical rock faces made bypassing it entirely impossible for the heavily loaded vehicles and the desperately needed artillery pieces. If we cannot cross that gorge, we will have to abandon all our heavy equipment and leave the wounded behind to die in the snow, an exhausted staff officer stated grimly. Smith vehemently rejected this horrific notion, demanding an immediate, wildly unconventional solution to completely rebuild the shattered bridge structure. The ingenious solution proposed by the Engineering Corps involved utilizing prefabricated treadway bridge sections, massive steel components specifically designed to support the immense weight of modern tanks. However, there was a massive logistical nightmare preventing this brilliant theoretical plan from becoming a life-saving reality on the frozen battlefield. The 1st Marine Division possessed absolutely no treadway bridge sections within their surrounded perimeter at Cotonou, and the nearest supply depot was safely located miles away at the distant coastal port of Hungnam. The heavy steel sections would literally have to fall from the freezing sky if the trapped men were to survive. A desperate, highly classified radio message was immediately transmitted to the United States Air Force Combat Cargo Command, urgently requesting the impossible airborne delivery of the massive bridge sections. The seasoned transport pilots were initially stunned by the sheer audacity of the unprecedented request, as parachuting objects weighing several tons into a narrow mountain pass had never been successfully attempted in combat. Despite the terrifying risks involved, the dedicated air crews quickly devised an experimental rigging system, utilizing multiple heavy-duty cargo parachutes securely attached to each individual 2-ton steel bridge component to aggressively slow their incredibly dangerous, rapid descent. On the morning of December 7th, 8 massive cargo aircraft roared over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Taebaek Mountains, bravely navigating through heavy cloud cover and intense enemy anti-aircraft fire. The freezing Marines on the ground watched in absolute, breathless anticipation as the massive steel sections were aggressively shoved out of the cargo bays, plummeting toward the earth before the enormous parachutes violently snapped open. 6 of the 8 critically needed sections landed safely within the heavily fortified American perimeter, successfully delivering the essential raw materials required to begin the most crucial engineering project of the entire Korean War. Before the incredibly heavy bridge sections could be carefully transported to the gorge, the surrounding heights overlooking the Funchalen Pass had to be violently cleared of entrenched Chinese defenders. This absolutely suicidal mission was aggressively assigned to the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, who were forced to launch a brutal, uphill infantry assault into the teeth of a blinding, sub-zero blizzard. The heavily armed Chinese soldiers occupied seemingly impregnable concrete bunkers, raining devastating machine gun fire down upon the shivering Marines who were desperately crawling up the steep, slippery, ice-covered slopes in a horrific, bloody battle for absolute tactical supremacy. The vicious struggle for the dominant peak, known as Hill 1081, raged continuously through the darkest hours of the freezing night and into the bitterly cold following morning. The exhausted Marines utilized their bayonets, entrenching tools, and point-blank grenade throws to systematically eradicate the fanatical Chinese defenders holding the heavily fortified ridgeline. Despite suffering from severe frostbite and catastrophic combat casualties, the Americans eventually secured the vital high ground, discovering that many of the Chinese soldiers had literally frozen to death inside their defensive trenches while tightly clutching their jammed, useless weapons in a final act of frozen defiance. With the overlooking heights finally secured, the incredibly dangerous process of transporting the massive treadway sections down the steep, icy mountain road to the destroyed Gatehouse Bridge began in earnest. The heavily armored construction tractors repeatedly slipped and slid dangerously close to the terrifying edge of the bottomless gorge, requiring the exhausted combat engineers to painstakingly maneuver the 2-ton steel behemoths entirely by hand. Working directly under the terrifying cover of darkness and the constant threat of distant enemy mortar fire, the incredibly brave engineers began the highly complex, desperately urgent assembly of the critical life-saving structure. By the late afternoon of December 9th, the seemingly impossible engineering miracle had been successfully achieved, and the solid steel treadway bridge firmly spanned the terrifying 1,000-foot abyss. General Smith personally inspected the hastily constructed crossing, watching nervously as the very first heavily loaded jeep slowly crawled across the groaning steel planks to test the structural integrity. The bridge miraculously held firm, triggering a massive, collective wave of profound relief that instantly washed over the thousands of freezing, exhausted Marines anxiously waiting to finally escape the horrific, blood-soaked confines of the deadly Taebaek mountain range. The massive, heavily battered column immediately began to slowly cross the newly constructed bridge, marking the definitive, triumphant climax of their incredibly desperate breakout from the Chosin Reservoir. The dead and the severely wounded were respectfully transported first, followed closely by the heavily armed infantrymen who cast wary, exhausted glances back toward the frozen peaks that had nearly become their permanent icy graves. They had successfully defied the insurmountable odds, aggressively shattered the invisible noose, and were finally marching continuously southward toward the warm coastal waters, leaving behind a completely devastated, strategically broken Chinese military force. As the heavy treads of the leading tanks carefully rolled across the newly installed steel bridge at Funchalen Pass, a profound shift occurred in the psychological atmosphere of the American column. The sheer terror of being permanently trapped slowly evaporated, replaced by a deep, hardened pride that radiated from the exhausted survivors. They had faced overwhelming numerical superiority and the most brutal environmental conditions imaginable, yet they remained cohesive. They walked out of the frozen abyss not as a defeated army, but as a legendary force that had shattered the teeth of the trap meant to consume them. The treacherous descent from the Taebaek Mountains finally brought the battered Marines out of the extreme sub-zero temperatures and into the relatively milder climate of the coastal plain. For the first time in nearly 3 agonizing weeks, the heavily layered troops could briefly loosen their frozen parkas and feel something resembling warmth. The winding dirt road gradually transformed into a wider, flatter route leading directly toward the industrial port city of Hungnam. A massive armada of United States Navy vessels was already gathering just offshore, representing an unbreakable shield of heavily armed salvation waiting patiently for their arrival. General Song Shilun refused to easily relinquish his heavily battered prey, ordering his surviving divisions to aggressively pursue the retreating American forces down the mountain slopes. However, as the Chinese infantry finally emerged from the protective cover of the deep inland valleys, they immediately encountered the devastating, overwhelming reality of American naval supremacy. Massive 16-inch guns from battleships anchored just off the coast unleashed a terrifying, continuous barrage of high-explosive shells directly into the advancing enemy formations. The pursuing Chinese columns were systematically obliterated before they could ever maneuver close enough to launch another coordinated infantry assault. The surviving elements of the 1st Marine Division finally marched into the heavily fortified defensive perimeter established around the bustling port of Hungnam on December 11th. The weary soldiers were immediately greeted by the incredibly surreal sight of massive supply dumps, functioning mess halls serving hot food, and rows of pristine hospital tents. Men who had fought like desperate animals in the frozen wilderness now found themselves standing in quiet, stunned disbelief amidst the overwhelming abundance of the coastal sanctuary. They collapsed onto the frozen ground, entirely drained of adrenaline, finally allowing their battered bodies to desperately rest. General Oliver P. Smith immediately began coordinating the massive, unprecedented amphibious evacuation of his entire fighting force, alongside tens of thousands of desperate North Korean civilian refugees. The logistical complexity of safely loading an entire combat-ready division onto waiting transport ships while simultaneously defending a shrinking coastal perimeter was absolutely staggering. Military police directed endless lines of heavily damaged trucks, exhausted infantrymen, and heavily bandaged casualties toward the massive loading ramps of the waiting naval vessels. Every single functioning weapon, vehicle, and crucial piece of heavy artillery was meticulously catalogued and aggressively secured for the long maritime journey. Aboard the pristine hospital ships anchored safely in the harbor, the true, horrific physical toll of the brutal campaign was finally revealed to the dedicated medical personnel. Doctors worked tirelessly around the clock, systematically treating thousands of severe frostbite cases and horrific combat wounds that had been hastily patched with frozen bandages. Private First Class Hector Cafferata, finally evacuated from the frontline carnage, received life-saving medical attention for his severe injuries sustained during his heroic defense. "Just fix me up so I can get back to my unit," Cafferata demanded weakly, reflecting the unbreakable spirit of the surviving infantrymen. In the distant, snow-covered mountains overlooking the massive naval operation, the heavily battered Chinese High Command grimly assessed the catastrophic outcome of their highly ambitious offensive. General Song Shilun's 9th Army Group had been completely decimated, suffering over 40,000 combat casualties and tens of thousands of severe frostbite cases. His massive, once formidable military force was now entirely incapable of conducting any further offensive combat operations and desperately required months of extensive rebuilding. The strategic objective of entirely annihilating the American division had completely failed, entirely due to the incredible tactical resilience of the heavily outnumbered defending forces. As the final American units methodically withdrew from the outermost defensive trenches and boarded the waiting transport ships, combat engineers prepared a final, devastating surprise for the enemy. They systematically rigged the entire port facility of Hungnam with thousands of tons of high explosives, carefully wiring every dock, crane, and abandoned supply depot for total, simultaneous destruction. The objective was to completely deny the advancing communist forces any usable infrastructure or strategically valuable material that could potentially aid their future military campaigns. The engineers worked quickly and silently, ensuring nothing of value would be left behind in the snow. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, the very last American landing craft slowly pulled away from the frozen docks, signaling the absolute completion of the historic amphibious withdrawal. A single, heavily protected plunger was forcefully depressed by a designated engineer safely positioned on a departing naval vessel, instantly detonating the massive network of strategically placed explosive charges. The entire waterfront of Hungnam erupted in a terrifying, apocalyptic fireball that violently shook the ocean and sent a towering mushroom cloud of dark smoke thousands of feet into the sky. The city was completely erased from the operational map. The enormous naval armada, consisting of nearly 200 heavily loaded transport ships and heavily armed warships, slowly turned southward toward the relative safety of South Korean ports. The massive fleet successfully carried over 100,000 military personnel, 17,000 vital vehicles, and roughly 98,000 desperate civilian refugees who had chosen to flee the advancing communist regime. The sailors and exhausted Marines crowded the icy decks, silently watching the massive pillar of smoke rising from the destroyed port slowly fade into the distant horizon. The bitter, frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir was finally left behind. General Smith stood quietly on the bridge of his command ship, reflecting deeply upon the unimaginable sacrifices endured by his incredibly resilient men over the past horrific month. He had successfully preserved the core fighting strength of the 1st Marine Division against seemingly insurmountable, absolutely terrifying odds in the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. His aggressive, Highly controversial tactical decisions and absolute refusal to accept defeat had miraculously saved tens of thousands of American lives from total annihilation. He knew his battered division would aggressively fight again, heavily hardened by the brutal, frozen forge of the northern mountains. The epic battle immediately cemented its place in the sacred lore of military history as a shining testament to sheer tactical brilliance and absolute human endurance. The strategic map showed a significant withdrawal, but the horrific casualty ratios and the complete destruction of the attacking Chinese armies told a remarkably different tactical story. The surviving veterans carried the deep, invisible scars of the extreme cold and the relentless combat for the rest of their natural lives. History would record it as a withdrawal, but the men of the Chosin few knew the truth. They had won the battle against human limits.